Everyone, and welcome. We're going to wait a few more seconds until people roll in, and then we'll get started in just a little bit. All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. More people are rolling in. I will start by introducing today's speaker, and then by the time I'm done, I think everyone will, will be present. So hello, everyone, and welcome to Meet VCU Authors. My name is Christina Stanchu, and I'm an Associate Professor of English at VCU and the Director of the Humanities Research Center. I'm delighted to welcome you today during one of the busiest months of the semester. Thank you so much for attending. It has been quite a busy semester and a busy year. Here at the HRC, we've been very busy. Our virtual events this semester included one workshop on book publishing, 3 lectures with national speakers, and 5 lectures with VCU authors sharing their latest books. Just as a, a heads up, our last event in the Meet VC Authors series will be next Monday, April the 26th. Kathleen Graber, who's a professor of English, will give a talk sponsored by the Richmond Public Library. For their help in setting up these events, I would like to thank Katie Reagan-Palmore, the HRC Administrative Coordinator, as well as the communications team in the Dean's office, especially Tyler Conrad, who is working his magic behind the scenes right now. Many thanks to the alumni in the audience for your continued support of the HRC at VCU. And if you're not receiving our brand new monthly newsletter, I guess it's not that brand new, we started in January, Katie Reagan will be posting the link in the chat. A word on our format. I will introduce our speaker briefly, and then she'll take about 40 minutes to introduce her to her latest book, and then we'll have some time for questions. You can use the Q&A function to post your questions during the presentation, and I'll try to address them in the order in which they are received. So I am delighted to introduce Professor Aspen Brinton today, who is a political theorist and currently an assistant professor in the School of World Studies. Her research interests include democratic theory, dissident movements, East Central Europe, phenomenology, and the intellectual history of civil society and free speech. She received her bachelor's from Amherst College and her MA and PhD in political theory from Georgetown University. Before joining VCU in 2018, I've just learned, as we were chatting before the talk, she taught at Boston College, at the University of Pennsylvania, and at Northwestern University and Georgetown University's campuses in Doha, Qatar. Professor Brinton's first book, Philosophy and Dissidence in Cold War Europe, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2016, examines the philosophical legacy of Eastern European dissidents during the Cold War. In this book, Brinton examines how Cold War dissidents in Central and Eastern Europe turned to the past for inspiration in order to change and transcend their present entrapment. Professor Brinton's second book continues this investigation in her forthcoming book from the University of Chicago Press next month, we hope. The title of her new book is Confronting Totalitarian Minds, Jan Patoska on Politics and Dissidence, which examines the legacy of Czech phenomenologist Jan Patočka, along with several contemporary applications of his ideas about dissident solidarity and existential confrontations with our unjust politics. Aspen Brinton, as we'll learn today, puts Patočka's ideas about dissidents, citizen mobilization, and civic responsibility in conversation with those of notable world historical figures like Mohandas Gandhi, thus expanding the current possibilities of comparative political theory. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brinton to the HRC.
everyone, and thank you, Christina, for the wonderful invitation and the honor of talking at the Humanities Center today. And also thank you to Tyler and to Katie Reagan for being behind the scenes and for doing this. And also thank you to all those in my department at VCU who have supported me in my time here. The School of World Studies has been a great place to teach. So today, I want to talk about a book that has been really a kind of half a dozen years in the making, and it has been an extension of a long series of intellectual interests with the region of Eastern Europe, but also with the question of confronting injustice. The courses I teach at VCU are in the area of social justice and the areas of activism generally understood. And so that comes out of a lot of thinking about how the lessons of Eastern Europe can be applied more generally throughout the world. And that this then is a cross-cultural and cross-historical kind of conversation where the premise of doing political theory is to look backwards into the archives of human knowledge and human understanding in order to then look freshly and newly at problematic, difficult circumstances that seem confounding, that seem confusing, that seem to be beyond our understanding, but that have, given the mimetic nature and repetitive nature of the human condition, probably have been around before in some other form. And so political theory as a humanistic discipline goes back into the text of philosophy and back into the texts of different sort of political writings in order to try to shed light on our current conundrums and our current political problems, of which I think we have no shortage of at the moment. So in the past few years, I think the meaning of this book has changed, as has the title of it. The title, Confronting Totalitarian Minds, is the second title of the project. Originally, the whole project was the same title as chapter 3, which I'll get to in a moment, was called Solidarity of the Shaken, because I was interested in forms of solidarity and this very kind of fascinating term that Jan Patoska had to describe solidarity across state borders, across classes, across genders, across cultures, and that there was a sense of solidarity that could unite people through their experience of living through history together. And that this philosophy of history, captured in his book called Heretical Essays on the Philosophy of History, is fascinating because it tries very hard to be heretical. And so the title itself shifted to Confronting Totalitarian Minds, partially in honor of the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz, who published an amazing book in the 1950s called Captive Mind, which has been a point of intellectual formation for me over many years. And I've made many students read it as well. And it operates on the premise that your mind can be captured and imprisoned in certain sort of ways and become subject to kinds of totalitarian isms, that there is now one totalitarian regime that was a historical phenomenon, but the presence is that the premise is that the capturing of your mind can happen at any time and in any place in a totalitarian way. And those who have lived through the actual historical totalitarianisms in Eastern Europe, that of both the Soviet communist regime, which was the case for Patoska, as well as in Nazi Germany and in other forms of authoritarian government, they already, in a sense, know this, that ideology and politics and cultural forces can capture your mind. And so that really the overall arch of my research projects have been to harness that wisdom of that historical rooted experience from this particular region of the world and of their own particular historical experience, because not everyone has lived through these kinds of circumstances, and then to theorize them and to pull out the concepts and to pull out the ideas to then help us understand politics in other places and times, including our own. Today, I want to focus on our own times to some degree while showing you the categories and concepts behind Patočka's thinking, but also to give you a sense of the way the book itself uses history to then create a conversation that is hopefully on a different plane than our everyday normal conversations about politics, and that is a conversation that can, in a classic Socratic way, dig into our given assumptions, dig into our prejudices, dig into our inclinations to stereotype and to assume we already know things, and instead to ask questions and to figure out how to ask questions that unpack what a totalitarian mind is and loosen up our own thinking towards new horizons. So that's the short story of where the title came from. And then here's just the table of contents of the soon to be forthcoming book. The logistics of the publishing are a little bit tied up in COVID complications, but it should be in print soon, insofar as it has page numbers, which is a good stage. So the book is, in a sense, as you can see here from the table of contents, a series of conversations. Now, why conversations? Conversations are then assumed to be a place where people can change the way they think about things if they are confronted, back to the other word in the title, with new ideas, different ideas, ideas they disagree with, ideas that they have some in common with, but that are then at some level of distinction that helps them think through anew what they already thought they knew before. And so these 5 conversations with Patočka's work are with different sorts and types of activists at very different levels of proximity to Patočka himself. On the slide, you can see the world's shortest biography of Jan Patočka, just so we get a sense of who he is. This is the street named after him in Prague. He is well known enough in the Czech Republic to have this street. And you can see this very short biography there to see where he lived, which was from 1907 until 1977. The quick translation there is that he was a philosopher, a phenomenologist, a professor. He was a fighter for human rights. He was a spokesman for Charter 77, and he died at the hands of secret police during interrogation. And so those few facts, if you can imagine your own biography written onto a street sign, you know that most of that it's all true, but it is bordering on the mythological and the apocryphal in certain instances, in that you can't get his whole life onto the street sign. But since the streets of Prague are really sort of part of where my love for this region began, it is a magical place, this city. I start with this because it shows the condensed version of his life. He was born very, in a sense, in a traditional academic environment. He trained with Husserl and with Heidegger in Germany, and then came back to Prague, where he was not allowed to teach at different times. He could teach for a little bit, the political situation changed, he was kicked out of the university, the political situation changed again, like in 1968, he came back, he taught for a few years, and then he was kicked out of public life again because he was not a committed communist. And so that put his life in this kind of precarious position, but he never stopped writing. He just wrote and he wrote and he wrote, primarily in the Czech language and only a few occasional things in German. And so this left his work largely unknown to the rest of the world until after 1989. There was a small group of philosophers in Germany and in France that knew of his writing, that knew of his work, and who undertook efforts to smuggle his writings out of Prague during the communist regime. So they would hide them in the trunk of vehicles and in secret pockets in briefcases and so on and so forth, and get them out to France and publish some of them. But it was only a very small portion of what was known. And so really what became known of Patočka has been a recent phenomenon. So access to his work in other languages is primarily in French and German, and then A few books are translated into English, and more have been translated recently. And so this book is also a kind of effort to participate in that world creation of this voice being given an academic legitimacy as well as a legitimacy within political theory. As is the case of the second word on the street sign, the phenomenologist, he has been given the most attention by philosophers who are interested in the technical details of phenomenology, which is a branch of continental philosophy, and he's taken very seriously, but this is a small community, and it is a small kind of technically oriented community concerned with Husserl and Heidegger and complicated abstract ideas. But in reading his more political essays, what I'm really trying to argue in this book is that these are political ideas that have a much wider audience than the philosophical conversations beforehand were able to reveal. And so to try to expand his voice into the discipline of comparative political theory is then what these conversations are trying to do. This requires being a bit of a translator, and not just a translator out of the Czech language, which is a notoriously difficult one, but a translator in terms of philosophical concepts. And so that as an author, I am trying to translate these 5 concepts that are represented on the table of contents to be able to be used in understanding contemporary dissident movements and activism. So I use each of the historical characters as a mediator for this translation. So what you see here, Václav Havel, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Mahatma Gandhi, atomic activism and environmental activism, these are all points of helpful translation for me to try to demonstrate what the categories are about. And once that demonstration has occurred, then to be able to apply them to contemporary movements. So I'll say now a little bit about what each of these chapters tries to do and what then the concepts are, and hopefully then open that up to thinking about what's going on today. The background, of course, is that the news headlines now are full of ideas about politics and dissidence. We have lived through a true historical moment in Richmond in the last year of politics and dissidence and our streets erupting. And so the book begins with a preface. I'm quoting some of the activists that are there in the streets, including one from Hong Kong, which is this upper picture. This is from the Maidan, the protests in Ukraine in 2014. Here is Belarus up in this corner. This one's from the Gezi Park protests. This was a meme. And here we have Richmond. And then below is a historical photograph of 1989 in Prague. And so it was within the protests of 1989 that I became interested in looking further at Patočka's work to try to understand what had happened then. You can see here this quote from Patočka. This is the most probably comprehensible, least abstract sentence I can offer, and this is the most quoted Patočka sentence out there. Okay, you pick up anything, and this is what is quoted. And it came back, and it was quoted again in 1989, which is then how I figured out who Patočka was, because Václav Havel, the dissident who led the movement in '89 in Czechoslovakia, saw Patočka as a mentor, as an intellectual mentor. And that he then started sort of discussing what Patočka had meant to him. And then from there, I ended up back at this text, which is quoted here, this 2 Charter 77 texts, to see what Patočka had to say about why he participated in Charter 77. Charter 77 was in 1977. It was the year and the reason Patočka was interrogated by the secret police, and later then, a few days after that interrogation, he passed away. And he was interrogated because this charter was in protest to the communist regime at the time. It was pointing out the hypocrisy of the regime in its treatment of human rights of its own citizens. And it was a small movement. It was signed by fewer than 300 people, but it nonetheless was an important moment for Patoska because he stepped out of somewhat professorial obscurity of writing for the drawer and staying below the limelight. Havel named him the spokesman. Again, that was what was on the street sign, right? The spokesman for Charter 77. Havel asked him to be the spokesman. He agreed. He stepped into the political arena. And then his own fragile health issues combined with the police interrogation led to his death. So there was a kind of mythology of political sacrifice behind this activism, behind him stepping into the streets. And this then, I think, is the hook to kind of get people interested in his story, but then it raises this fascinating intellectual question of whether or not that sentiment was there all along in his intellectual and in his philosophical work, like whether you could see this moment coming in his life, right? His stepping into politics, because we all have to make this choice, right? Do we go to the street protest? Do we go and stand in front of the police, and risk our lives? Do we, especially this past year, right? Do we expose ourselves to the coronavirus by going out to the protest? Do we take these kind of risks and sacrifice? And what is there in our brain, in our uncaptivated mind, so to speak, that helps us do that? And so really going back to reading Patočka's philosophical work was this question of, have these ideas, in a sense, always already been there, but because he was writing for the drawer, because almost nothing was published, because almost nothing got outside the Czech Republic, that this genealogy had not been able to be seen. And the short answer is yes. I mean, I think you go back to his very early stuff and you start to see that, and we'll see that again by the end. And part of doing the research for this and trying to sort of trace that genealogy of whether that political being was there in the first hand meant going back to the archives where many of his texts are kept. There's two archives. There's one in Prague and there's another in Vienna. I spent a semester at an archive and institute in Vienna, which is here. And you can see this. These are samizdat texts. So samizdat is a Russian word, but is now recognized in many different languages for, in a sense, secret underground publishing that was below the radar of the authorities and that was passed around on these very thin, as you can see, typescript manuscripts, right? You can see the type through the other side of the page. And that was because people were doing this in their basements. They were doing it illegally, and that these texts were seen as subversive and dangerous. And so they put the lives and the freedom of their writers at risk. And so Patočka was involved in this for a very long period of time, right? So the first point of the archives is there's just a lot of these, and there's a lot of them before these 1977 texts that are here in the picture. And so part of what I did was to go through these and also then compare them with the translations, but then also to kind of get a sense of the big ideas, of the big takeaways to then bring back to political theory to talk about this. There's many other scholars who have dug into the details of these texts on the linguistic, on the literary, but again, sort of in being concerned with the politics, I wanted to then choose these interlocutors, choose the conversation points that would make Patočka make sense to the wider world. So the first one was, of course, the most proximate in chapter 1, to talk about Václav Havel and who he was as his eventual end was as a playwright, but then before that, his eventual end was as the president of the Czech Republic. Prior to that, he was a playwright and a dissident and worked both in the theater when it was legal at certain points during the communist regime, that was the case, but also in the underground theater when it was not legal. Havel was involved in that and really kind of leading this movement to defend human rights. So the first chapter goes into the concept of living in truth. And so what's here on the screen in the photograph, this is a photograph I took in a museum, is a 1979 poster for one of Havel's plays that took place in Vienna at the Academy Theater. This was an exhibition there. And then this is Havel's typewriter, which they brought in for it, where he was typing some of these texts. But this is the preface to a 1990 conference where a group of scholars was coming together for the first time to try to figure out what to do with all of Patočka's samizdat text, right? They had all of these things. Some of them had been saved in Paris, some of them had been saved to parts of Germany, and that then some of them were still intact in the Czech Republic. And so as the conference gathered, Václav Havel sent them a letter and said, well, this is why Professor Patočka's work means something. So I mean, I won't read this whole letter, but this was his message to academics, right? You need to go back into Patočka's text and you need to find, what's this very last sentence here, how to be in truth. And the translation's a little bit awkward, right? To be and to exist and to live in truth are similar phrases that pop up all throughout Patočka's work as well as throughout Havel's work. And it was a conversation between them. What does it mean to live in truth? And the biggest takeaway of this chapter is that living in truth is not an individual thing. It's not, the truth is not inside your own head. It is not your own solipsistic, narcissistic subjectivity. That is not what truth is, right? You don't create it yourself. You create it socially, you create it politically, you create it in conversation with other people. And so to live in truth, you can never do by yourself. And so that this sort of takeaway from Havel has sort of deep sort of roots in some of Patočka's ideas. So the first chapter, I in a sense put these things back in conversation with each other. What would Havel say to this idea in Patočka, and what would Patočka say to Havel's idea and to Havel's later writings? To take a hypothetical scenario of if Patočka had not died, how would he have talked to Havel about the '89 transition? How would he have talked to Havel about his own political work? And that then that hypothetical becomes the basis for a textual back and forth. So there, I quote both of them, I go back into their text and look at what it really means to live in truth. And this is applicable, I think, to all dissident movements really kind of broadly. How do you figure out what's true and what's not true? It is not just inside your own head, right? You have to kind of go through a whole process. So that opens the book. And then I shift in the next chapter to looking at an anti-Nazi dissident, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in large part inspired by the frequent and repeated use all throughout Patočka's work of this phrase, the care of the soul. He means it sometimes in a religious or a Christian sense, but only that's a fraction of the meaning for him, right? The soul is also a very secular possibility. It's connected to politics, it's connected to the Socratic form of asking questions, it's connected to the cultivation of knowledge, the cultivation of a sense of being willing to examine the world and to not know everything beforehand, a kind of humility to do that. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a theologian and a writer who participated in the Abwehr plot to assassinate Hitler as a young academic in Nazi Germany. And so just to give the translation of this sign, this is a plaque on a church in Berlin. This is where Dietrich Bonhoeffer this as a pastor, but as a Widerstandskämpfer, so as, again, a sort of fighter against the Nazi. This is the German term for those who fought against the Nazis. And so he was executed by the Nazis, Bonhoeffer, imprisoned, and the rest, but was able to produce lots of writings about why he was doing what he was doing. He wrote the whole time he was in prison. Those texts were recovered. He also wrote sort of, half a dozen formal academic books before Hitler came to power. And so again, you have another figure who you have a whole long history of ideas about why you fight against injustice, why you do it. And of course, Bonhoeffer as a pastor talks explicitly about the religious aspects. And so it creates a kind of heretical conversation with Patočka, who was not deeply religious, but who still insisted upon using this word soul all the time. So even though phenomenology and the kind of heirs of Husserl and Heidegger are not really theistic philosophers, Patočka persisted in using this term in large part because of some of its political power. And so we have, of course, just seen a presidential campaign that was, quote unquote, fighting for the soul of America. I think it's probably not a coincidence that Biden chose this, right? Trying to appeal to both the religious community and the secular community at the same time. But also to go back to Havel's statement here about why Patočka's work is politically relevant is because, as he says here, it calls for a spiritual conversion in terms of like how you look at the world. And spiritual is much broader in Czech, the way the word is used, than it is in English, right? It sort of includes all of the sort of notions of spirit that are not necessarily explicitly religious. And so to look at Bonhoeffer's work and Patočka's work in conversation is to pull that out, right? To sort of pull out why that in situations of totalitarianism and in Hitler's Nazi Germany, as well as in the situations of the communist regimes, that you had to turn towards the soul and spiritual resources in some form, even if, as this quote indicates, right, Socrates is your kind of spiritual resource, who's a non-Christian, non-religious figure as well, right? That there is such a thing as that, and that it needs to come into politics, in part again to uphold some sort of, back to the first quote, to uphold this sort of stance of morality, right? That if morality is going to be real, it has to have some sort of non-movable, sort of fixed idea. And then in the third chapter, I turn to Patočka's work, and the sentences on this slide should be kind of like what I would like to be in a room giving you on a sheet of paper as a handout rather than putting on a slide. So my apologies here for the format. But if this were on a sheet of paper and you were taking it away as a kind of piece of Patočka's philosophy, what it summarizes is his whole kind of conception of what human life is from start to finish in a philosophical way. And he calls this the three movements of human existence. And this is one short summary of it. And it nonetheless constitutes a whole sort of body of philosophical work trying to sort of sort out the relationship between your individual existence and political existence and the rest. From there, this abstract idea, what I do in this chapter is I take it and I try to apply it to Gandhi's life in order to demonstrate that all activists, right, in many different contexts, then follow a kind of progress that relates their human work to their actual groundedness and to their culture, to then their seeking of meaning through politics, right? Dissident politics is largely a seeking of meaning through political action. And so you see this in Patočka very clearly, and you can see it in Gandhi very clearly. And so that this idea of movement and movement being perpetual, and you never really getting to the final stage of eradicating all injustice everywhere. This is demonstrated through this conversation between Gandhi and Patočka. And much of this chapter is also concerned with the metaphor of music, because Patočka uses this idea of, as he says, polyphonic composition, that you're composing your life like a musician composes an opera. And so I talk about Philip Glass's opera, Satyagraha, about Gandhi. And in a sense, that sort of shows, I'm trying to take the very, very abstract and make it much more concrete. Similarly, in the chapter on solidarity of the shaken, right, I take this idea of solidarity and I discuss it in terms of activism of the atomic age. I call it atomic activism to put it under the umbrella of all those who fought against nuclear weapons in some kind of form, in some kind of place, or even sort of tangentially mentioned it, like the Students for Democratic Society in the US. I end up quoting them at some length because they understood the nuclear situation as a change and as something different. And Patočka understood the nuclear situation as this sort of shifting point of why solidarity had to become different after the nuclear bomb than it was before. There is something about nuclear weapons and also nuclear fallout, the environmental impact of nuclear weapons, that makes things global in a way that they were not before. And it makes history universal to him. So history as a universal phenomenon of all human peoples together is what he attributes the nuclear weapon having done. And you can see this in the text of the activists that I talk about in this chapter. And I focus on the American case in this chapter to kind of give a coherence to the 1960s activism in the US. The examples are pulled from actual statements made by those who are fighting against the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, and that these statements, because the form of solidarity that you see there is the sense of we are all about to be destroyed, okay? So what is solidarity of the shaken? It's the recognition that massive destruction is on its way, but that nonetheless creates an equality between us that has been unprecedented before us. And we are literally shaken in recognition of our own death and our death together with others, right? You're not gonna die alone, you're gonna die with the other million people in the city that live with you, right? And so that shared death becomes a point of solidarity. It is dramatic, it is melodramatic even, But there it has this kind of underlying sort of change of structure that helps me for the last substantive chapter talk about the environmental movement, because structurally the environmental movement in our own time has much in common with the nuclear movement, and that at the end point there is a sense that we are all destroyed together. Okay. Now again, however dramatic and melodramatic that seems, it creates a certain sort of activism. So in the last chapter, I talk about various things I never thought I would talk about in the same breath as a phenomenological philosopher from the Czech Republic. I talk about Extinction Rebellion and Pope Francis. Even the Monkey Wrench Gang and Edward Abbey books get mentioned briefly. And this is in part to kind of demonstrate that there is this strain of Patočka's thinking back to his dissertation in 1917, which was called The Natural World as a Philosophical Problem, again, to complete the genealogical circle, where this idea of nature as the center of the three movements of existence, that you can't move through the world without recognizing what your relationship with nature is. And so the whole climate catastrophe situation forces us to reevaluate what our relationship with nature is, not as sort of exploitative, technological, we can do with it what we want, but that we need it for our own survival to prevent our own shipwrecked existence from coming to happen. And again, the quote I pull out here to look at later is one where he uses the metaphor of music. The ostinato of life polyphony, which I've highlighted at the end, is ostinato is a sort of repetitive theme in a musical composition of polyphony of all the different voices. There's a commonness to all the different voices, again, that becomes global in this context. And then to wrap up, why does all of this matter and what does it look like for his future vision? One of the strangest tasks of doing this research was to try to figure out what he really thought the future should be, because he couldn't ever say it without fearing for his own life if he didn't say it in a way that matched the right ideology, or if someone did find this. So he was constantly tucking these pieces of political wisdom into things like, you know, an analysis of Husserl's Crisis of the Life Sciences, right? So you think it's some obscure philosophical text about Husserl and you go into it and really he's pontificating about politics. The title of the essay has nothing to do with what's in the essay. And so you can see these fascinating moments. And so these are a couple of the quotes where he talks about the vision that he would like to see in the world, where you can see his activism and his stepping into the streets within his philosophical thinking beforehand. And that for him, always in the back of his mind is the Socrates figure, right? The world where Socrates does not have to die. So the world where someone who protests, someone who dissents, someone who disagrees with the politics of the day shouldn't have to die. Now, how do you create a polity or a political world where that's the case? We are, in this sense, Socrates' successors, are his word. And what do you need to do that? At the bottom of this quote, you need a plan of what is truth, and you need an outline of all being, which is to say that the politics is a philosophical task as much as it is actually going out into the streets. You need to understand what you are there for in order to then understand your role in history. So the history of the future is this fascinating idea that the history of the future is, of course, our present, right? How will the future describe us now in our present, right? That's the imperative political question. If you can imagine how the future will tell the history of today, you can then act politically in this way consistent with Patočka's philosophy. And much of that then is about confronting the totalitarianism in your own head, as well as it is participating with others in that confrontation. So that's 40 minutes. So there's, of course, much more. It's a whole book, but I will stop with that and take questions at this stage. I'd love to talk about direct applications to dissident movements now, but let's sort of let the audience maybe drive which things I talk about there.
It's wonderful, Aspen. Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Just to remind folks, I think I can also unmute you. So if you'd like to ask a question live, just raise your hand. We have a question from Kai Bosworth to start with, but before we start, I just wanted to say that, you know, as somebody who lived through the totalitarian regime in Romania by the time I was 15 or so, your talk has resonated on so many levels, and I have so many questions for you, but I'll save them for a later date. So thank you so much for your research and your work. This is what Kai is asking. Was totalitarian more or less Patočka's description of the conditions for a captured mind? And if so, does it have a genesis, direct or indirect, in Hannah Arendt?
Yes, that's a great question about Patočka's relationship to Arendt and her work. Some of Arendt's text got across the Iron Curtain. They definitely got to him, and especially in his later work in heretical essays, he's quoting Arendt directly in that text. He's quoting more the human condition, but you can definitely see that he is knowledgeable of the framework of totalitarianism that's there. In his conversation with Havel, Václav Havel uses the term post-totalitarianism in his work, which is to mean the type of totalitarianism after the violence of Stalin's Gulag stops. It's not the concentration camps, but it is this constant looming threat of Soviet tanks perhaps coming across the border as they did in '68. It's the constant censorship. It's the lack of academic freedom. It's the lack of cultural freedom. So the really kind of charade that everyone was obliged to undertake in pretending that they were loyal to the communist regime. And so that term post-totalitarianism in Havel is an occasion to then talk about what is a little bit more philosophically abstract in Patočka, which is his interpretation of Husserl on the life world, and the degree to which that life world in phenomenological terms gets shut down by certain modes of thinking, and especially this mode of thinking of pretending to be something you're not, which is what the politics of totalitarianism demands of you. And that if you then pretend to not be truthful for a long enough period of time, you as a person become untruthful. And so that this dynamic of totalitarianism kind of seeping into the way you think is addressed indirectly in Patočka, very directly in Havel, but is definitely then taking up many of the same themes that are there in Arendt. I think I'd love to do a spin-off paper about Patočka and Arendt. I think it would be great, but on the list. Not yet there.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. We'll take a live question, and then the next person with Patricia Cummings. And then Mark Wood has posted a question in the chat. I wonder if you would like to ask it live, Mark, after Patricia. So Patricia, you are unmuted. Please go ahead. No.
Patricia still seems to be muted from my view.
Okay.
Okay, there I am.
There you are. Okay. Hi, Patricia. Hi, Pat.
Yes. When I was in college, it was 1968, and we had Dubček making all kinds of special pleas and so on. I was just wondering if the 1968 events were very inspiring for your author, or was there any connection between the events that happened then, and how do you put it together, and was it a part of your own research?
Definitely. Actually, the cover of the book is a photograph from 1968. I don't want to put up the slides again, but part of the reason we chose that, the editor and I, is thinking through this moment in 1968 where the Soviet tanks came into Prague. Dubček, who was the leader of Czechoslovakia, was kind of kidnapped, taken off to Moscow, forced into concessions, and that the people themselves were then put under a regime called normalization. And even this term normalization, it has this sort of Foucaultian ring to it, was really, really oppressive. So for briefly in 1968, the Prague Spring had relaxed the censorship laws. Dubček had done that. He had allowed the theaters to open again. Patoska was teaching at a university for about a year and a half. There was a kind of opening and a flowering, and then the Soviets shut that down. Not only was it just massively depressing for everyone to have all of that taken away, it's like going back into lockdown, basically. Now we have this term. So kind of back into intellectual lockdown. It then really, I think, created a pessimism in Patočka's latter two books, The Heretical Essay and the Philosophy of History, and also a set of his lectures called Plato in Europe, which I actually begin with in the introduction, because he's lecturing in basements, he's lecturing in barns, he's like giving lectures on Plato and Aristotle, right? Two groups of students who were transcribing the notes, and all we really have left are these notes of his lectures about Plato, and then they were translated and compiled. So they were sort of written by Patočka, they were sort of written by his students. They have this kind of collective authorship, but he uses in those the word political distress. So the term political distress in Czech is very poetic in sort of various ways. Like distress refers to like the distress of a young child without a mother, and like it really is this kind of interesting word in Czech without a good English translation. But he uses that over and over again as if to say this actually does then create an entirely different sort of life. You just cannot be the same person in this kind of political space of normalization. And so, yeah, I mean, it definitely influenced his later work, yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a huge moment for the whole project, I think.
It really was very inspiring to my college generation. We were so hopeful, and then when the tanks moved in,
yeah,
there were Americans crying. I mean, I related to it personally. It was something that was internal, and we talked about it a lot on the college campuses then. And so I don't know, I'm very glad to see more came of it. I didn't know about your author at all until very recently with your book. But of course I knew about Havel because I think he won a Nobel Prize, if I'm not mistaken. But
he didn't win it, but he came close.
I thought he should have.
He has many different versions of himself. Now, there's a wonderful poster from 1989 that has 68 and 89. The poster can be flipped two ways, and so the 1989 was seen as a final reconciliation of what had happened in 68, right? That what should have happened, in 69 happened in 89, right? Like that this should have been the opening to democracy. It should have been the opening to kind of socialism with a human face, was the phrase that was used in 68. But instead it turned into totalitarianism anew, and everyone had to wait until 89 to kind of realize the momentum of that. So.
Thank you, Patricia, for your question, and of course, Aspen, for your answer. I think we might be able to go to Mark Wood next. Mark has a couple of questions here. Perhaps the second one could be a good fit to Patricia's question. If you would like to unmute yourself, please go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, thank you so much. An incredibly stimulating talk in so many different ways. I really appreciate the focus too on kind of taking the conversation to politics to a deeper level, to look at these underlying philosophical premises and so on and so forth. And so I had a longer question about that, but I'll wait till maybe another space. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about your own sense of the state of academia, I guess primarily here in the United States, in terms of it creating a space for genuine dissenting perspectives to be expressed. And you know that, right? I mean, I know you share, and I know we've had some conversation about this, concerns about that are kind of, widely debated at this point in time. I don't mean to put you on a hot spot.
I think that's fair. Where is my tenure case in the pipeline? No, I mean, I think, it's of course something I've thought about a lot. And the epilogue for the book, which I didn't talk about in the sense running out of time, is a meditation on a short story by the Czech author Bohumil Hrabal called Too Loud a Solitude. And it is really a story about censorship and about books and about what kind of existentially closing down spaces of free speech does to the soul, for lack of a better word, right? And that this then has a kind of character in it that reminded me of Patoska. So I use that at the closing, but at the end of that, right, that the world we all inhabit is one where we love books, right? We sort of that free exchange of conversation back and forth, of being able to have a conversation with someone who has a fundamentally different view than yourself, that doesn't put you in a position of precarity, of losing your job, or being shamed publicly on social media, or being sort of put out there in a way that then ruins your career and your livelihood in a way, is part of what is at stake in loving books, right? In order to do that, right, that we as authors need that free conversational space. Does that exist in academia in all places? No, I don't think it does, right? Like, but it's not like ubiquitously everywhere that there's a major problem. It's not, the whole institution is not corrupt. I got a chance to listen to a webinar that Angela Davis gave last week, speaking of dissidents in academia. And someone put her on the spot, okay, and said, well, isn't all this talk of abolition and all of the kind of racial justice work that you're doing, isn't it hypocritical for you to still work at a university, right? Because isn't the university part of the problem? Isn't it part of the established state? I think she also still is at a state school as well. And so, like, shouldn't you get out of like that institutional space in order to be more true to yourself? And she said, no, absolutely not. And this I'll have to agree with. And it made me think of the Patoska book. She says the intellectual work, right, of going back, of sitting in the archives, going through these obscure intellectual ideas. Herbert Marcuse was an influence for her as it was for me. She says you have to do that. The intellectual work has to happen before the work in the streets happens. And the universities are the place to do that self-consciously, knowing what they are, but then being able to use them in a subversive way, and that then creating those spaces for students, for thought, for books, again, for the love of books, to be able to then be self-consciously aware of what education you're receiving, in which spaces you are, and then to pass that on to future generations. And so, I mean, I think her and Patoska were right on the same page there, and I think I would agree with both of them to defer to someone. Yeah. So.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. If we have time at the end, maybe we'll go back to your first question.
Okay.
But for the time being, let's move on to Rohan's question. Rohan, I will unmute you and you can do the same on your end. And then we'll go to Josh Klein's question next. Great. Go ahead.
Hi, Rohan. Are you there?
Oh.
So
Maybe.
my question was, I had written it down before, but it was basically about the international context in which Jan Patoska wrote. So you mentioned you do like the kind of connective work of bringing him in conversation with other thinkers and activists today, but to what degree did he himself write about other political developments? For instance, since you mentioned Gandhi, did he write about imperialism or anti-colonialism or things like that, where he saw dissidents kind of at work? And maybe more broadly, to what degree do you think current events in his lifetime shaped his philosophy, if at all?
I mean, to take the last part first, in terms of current events in his own life, I mean, he lived through World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, nuclear weapons, all of the rest. When he referenced the colonial situation, he often used the term technocratic or technological civilization, deriving from kind of European conquest. It was in fairly kind of abstract Heideggerian terms. I mean, he never took up exactly a particular decolonization movement or a particular problem with European sort of history. He has been accused of being Eurocentric because of this lack of discourse in his own sort of the lack of explicit sort of answering of that question, right? And so that accusation has produced, papers here and there. But what's at the core of it is a large part having to do with his own isolation. I mean, I mentioned that for him, like how many books by Hannah Arendt could actually get across the border and back, right? These are smuggling instances. These are people risking their own life to get text and information back across this border. He would have been able to listen to Radio Free Europe. Maybe Christina remembers this. People would listen under, blankets, so they would hide under their couch and listen to Radio Free Europe, right? So that the information wasn't sort of fully there. He didn't ever explicitly mention Gandhi, right? So one of the premises of the book is a hypothetical conversation, right? If he could have had a conversation about this explicitly, how would the ideas have interacted? And so that methodologically is my own responsibility in the book. And so for him, he's outside of that and isolated to some degree. And so that this is, but taking the conversation, I think, is then an important aspect of it, because the context of the world wars, especially, right? The violence of it and what the world wars and the atomic weapons meant, the solidarity concept that comes from there, right, is explicitly relatable to decolonization. In lots of different ways. So I do talk about that in the chapter on Gandhi. What is it to be shaken by history, but to be caught up in these historical events in a vulnerable position, uniting with other people to try to rectify the situation? There, I think that they're definitely kind of in the same, in the same history, right? For him, history had this metaphysical meaning.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you both. And thanks, Rohan, for your question. I think we have time for 2 more questions. So we'll go to Josh Klein, and then we'll end with Ing Chao Kao's question. So Josh, I will try to unmute you if you can. Okay, there you go.
Hi, and thank you again for your lecture. It's been fascinating. I was just wondering if you could offer your feedback or your take on the current state of dissident movements in Central Eastern Europe, particularly the Polish and the Hungarian contexts, which saw similarly prominent civic movements in the 70s and 80s, like Charter 77, but have experienced relatively greater democratic backsliding since the end of the communist era. Thank you.
The book doesn't take this up directly, but of course, I follow the current politics in Eastern Europe and have deep frustrations about the character of Viktor Orban, having been one of the pro-democracy revolutionaries of 1989 and having now become a kind of nationalist totalitarian figure in his own state. The populist shift to the right in both the Czech Republic and Poland is of a concerning, is following a trend, right? And so that there, the conceptual level of the book does try to take up this question of what motivates people to become engaged in politics and to become engaged in politics on a nationalist level versus on a level of sort of wider global solidarity, right? And that what nationalism did in terms of war and wars, conflict in the world wars. Patoska would, I think, say, obviously that was hugely destructive, and that would be a shift back towards the kind of politics that created all the problems of World War II, especially, but that memory is short. And so that the memory of the pain of that experience not being there in the current generation means that the nationalist framework has a lot of appeal. It has, and Patoska was not entirely free of nationalism. If he were, he would have written in German instead of Czech, but he wrote all this in Czech, right? And so, but he also knew that his own people were limited in some way in their viewpoint of the world. And that's what philosophy gave him, was this wider global view. And so I think both he and Havel would be very disappointed, but it's the analysis of human nature that's there in Patoska's philosophy would say, well, yes, you have to be constantly vigilant against these kinds of things. Like a totalitarian mind is not something you get over once and then you're over it, right? It is a recurring mimetic thing that will continue to occur over time in different locations, in different places, which is then why how you get out of it matters, which is, sort of through sort of other forms of recognizing self-consciously that situation. So I think what's going on there would be a reason to say, well, revisit some of the past, right? Like a revisitation of the past could help kind of, give a kind of self-consciousness to that politics in the right context.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think Judith still had a similar question asking about how the Russian dissident Navalny is inspiring others today. I'm not sure if you want to address that.
Yeah, is he still alive at this hour? Right. Yeah, this is a precarious situation. I think if I were to put Navalny in one chapter of the book as of today, as he's apparently on the edge of death, I would put him in a similar category to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer did this amazing thing where he was safe in the United States. He was at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Hitler had come to power. He knew he wanted to go protest against Hitler. He knew Hitler was killing people. And he got on the boat and he went back to Germany. And so, that kind of move to go back to a state of danger is a form of political sacrifice, right? There's a whole section of the book on sacrifice. What does it mean to sacrifice yourself for the sake of a political idea? Navalny is right there. I mean, he's willing to literally risk it all in order to demonstrate a kind of truth about what the Putin regime says it is and what it actually does. And so this is, yeah, I mean, he could be right there in chapter 2 in Navalny, I think, had this happened more recently. So,
Thank you. And thank you, Judith, for your question. I think we have one last question. I'm sorry, we won't get to others. Ying Chao Kao, would you like to ask your question live?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Thank you. I'm really sorry if I mispronounced your name.
No problem, you did it perfectly. Hi, thank you so much for this thought-provoking presentation. I did learn a lot. So my question is asking from the geopolitical perspective of Taiwan, which is the comparable example along with the ZAG example as part of the third wave democratization. Because Taiwan is also a country that experienced the transition from the authoritarian tyranny to democratization. And that is also situated between two competing hegemonies currently between the US and China. So may I ask now, what is the contemporary implications of your idea of totalitarian minds? And I'm asking from the perspective about what does the political civilization of authoritarian regime and the totalitarianism mean or imply to our current understanding of the authoritarian Trumpism in the US and the Chinese Communist Party's totalitarian control of its people through speech censorship and digital surveillance, etc. And what does it mean to the people in the smaller countries that has been torn between those two mega powers, with some perspective of the resurgence of the populist totalitarian minds? Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think hopefully representative of some of the future trajectory that this research could go on. Because what I would do in that case, and this can give you a sense of the methodology of what this type of political theory is trying to do. I would say it's not for me to say what that relationship is about. I would go and I would try to find the text of dissidents in Taiwan. I would try to read what they've read. In the same sense, I tried to read what Patoska had said. I tried to read what Bonhoeffer said. I read a whole bunch of Gandhi's massive trove of text, right? What do the dissidents there in Taiwan think as their relationship with China? What do those on the streets have to say about the relationship with the US? What do they have to say about this between a rock and a hard place situation in which they find their relatively newer democracy trying to fend off the situation? So what is shakenness, right? So what is that sense of fragility, of that sense of being caught in the middle of a vulnerable moment of history? What does it mean to them? And then really then to ask the Socratic question would be what Patoska would say. Well, what do they know? What do they not know? And what should their questions be of the existing regimes and of their own government in and of itself? So that what then can the dissidents ask of their Taiwanese government to kind of shift the relationship with China in such a way that would then be upholding of human rights and of human dignity and of this idea of kind of being a fully moral human being? Like, can you actually be that person in Taiwan in certain contexts and certain instances? So, so this kind of research is trying to take the words of dissidents themselves seriously, which is a little bit heretical in political theory, which is sort of focused on canonical texts and, Hobbes, Locke, Plato, Aristotle, you're supposed to read these and the rest. But part of what I'm trying to do with Patoska, he's a kind of median figure, right? I mean, he is a philosopher and very well respected, but he's not very well known. And so this is a process whereby you take those who are dissidents, you take their text seriously, you do a reading of them, and that from there you then make conclusions and characterizations rather than kind of hovering in and like saying, well, this is what's going on. That wouldn't be the way you do the research. You would do it from the ground up. It literally is a kind of grassroots research strategy. And that from there, I would just love to read what the Taiwanese dissidents have to say. And then we could start the conversation, right? And ask the questions from there. And I think you can do that anywhere around the world with a set of ideas and a set of questions, which is part of the reason I put it in this format in this book.
Wonderful. I think we're at the end of our time today. Sorry, we went a little over, but the questions were so fascinating and the answers were even more so. And I hope we can continue these conversations maybe on campus in the fall.
Maybe. And I'm happy to have further conversations with anyone. I'm into conversations, as you can tell. I think it's the word I've said the most today. So please shoot me an email, be in touch.
We will definitely. And thank you so much for this amazing talk and just insightful presentation. And I also wanted to thank all of you for attending today's event, especially during this very busy end of April. Just a quick reminder before we go that our last event at the HRC will be next Monday on April 26th. Professor Kathy Graeber will give her talk on a recent volume of poetry called The River Twice, published by Princeton. And I hope some of you and your students can attend and help us celebrate the end of Poetry Month, which is April. So thank you so much for spending this time with us today and for supporting the humanities at VCU. Have a great week and see you next time. Thank you, Aspen.
Yes, thanks.